After my parents hired my brother as my new boss, he demoted me to ruin my career, then claimed it was for my own good and, hi, everyone. So, 28M, work in the family business. Well, I did until recently. It's a medium-sized company that I've poured the last 6 years of my life into. After graduating with a business degree, I joined as a junior manager and climbed the ranks, eventually earning the COO position. It wasn't handed to me either. I busted my ass, proved myself, and had the numbers to back it up. The business was thriving, and I felt like I was doing something meaningful. Then, about 6 months ago, my parents, Catherine and Richard, decided to shake things up. That's when they brought in my younger brother, Mason, 25M. Mason, the golden child. Mason, who has no business experience to speak of. Mason, who can barely manage his own schedule, let alone an entire company. I knew this was going to be a disaster the moment they told me, but I didn't realize just how bad it would get. Let me backtrack a bit so you understand the family dynamics. Growing up, Mason was the favorite, no question about it. He's the youngest of us 3 siblings, and our parents always coddled him. If Mason got in trouble at school, they'd make excuses for him. If he wanted something, he got it. Meanwhile, Haley, our older sister, 30F, and I were expected to be the responsible ones. Haley mostly stayed out of the drama, but I always resented the double standards. Anyway, when my parents announced that Mason would be joining the company, I asked a simple question. In what capacity? They looked at me like I just insulted their life choices. Catherine said Mason would be starting as the new CEO. I'm sorry. What? I'd been COO for 2 years, running the operations and keeping everything in check. I thought the natural progression would be for me to move up when my dad stepped down. But apparently, my parents decided that Mason's fresh perspective was what the company needed. When I pointed out that Mason had 0 qualifications, Catherine said, Logan, you've always been so serious. Mason has charisma. He'll bring energy to the team. Charisma, energy. These were the reasons my years of hard work were being overlooked. Cool, right? Mason strutted into the office like he owned the place, which, technically, he kind of did now. He didn't even bother learning the basics before making changes. Policies I'd spent months refining? Gone. Teams I'd carefully built? Reassigned. He didn't even bother consulting me. Instead, he called me into his new corner office one afternoon and said, Logan, I think we need to switch things up. I'm demoting you to regional manager. Regional manager. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to keep my cool and asked him why. His response? I think you need to get more hands-on experience. It'll be good for you. Good for me? I've been hands-on since day one. If anything, he should be the one learning from the ground up. But no, Mason thought he could waltz in, push me aside, and play boss. I appealed to my parents, hoping they'd see reason. They didn't. Catherine said, Mason's trying his best, Logan. Support him. He's your brother. Richard, ever the peacemaker, chimed in with, this could be an opportunity for you to grow in new ways. Are you kidding me? At first, I thought maybe I could make this work. Maybe Mason just needed time to adjust. But it became clear pretty quickly that he wasn't interested in running the business. He was interested in running me. Every decision he made seemed designed to humiliate me. He started showing up late to meetings I'd scheduled, criticizing my ideas in front of the team, and assigning me tasks that were way beneath my level of expertise. One day, he actually had the nerve to ask me to grab coffee for him. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. And the worst part? The team started noticing. People who used to respect me now looked at me with pity. A few even whispered that Mason was only there because of nepotism, which, duh, but it didn't make me feel any better. I was losing control of the company I'd helped build, and it felt like there was nothing I could do about it. Every time I tried to push back, Mason would smile that smug little smile of his and say, Logan, I'm the CEO. This is my call. The final straw came last week. Mason decided to cancel a deal I'd been working on for months with a major client. It was a game changer for us, and I'd negotiated every detail myself. Mason didn't even bother to understand the deal before killing it. He just said, I don't think it aligns with the direction I want to take the company. What direction? He doesn't have a direction. That's when I realized something wasn't adding up. This wasn't just about Mason being incompetent or my parents playing favorites. There was something more going on here. Why were my parents so insistent on propping Mason up, even at the expense of the company's success? Why did they seem so determined to push me aside? I don't have all the answers yet, but I'm going to find out. Because this isn't just about my career anymore, it's about my sanity. After Mason demoted me and started making one reckless decision after another, I knew I couldn't just sit back and take it. The company was tanking fast under his leadership. A few of the senior staff, people I've worked with for years, started voicing their concerns to me privately. Jenna, our head of marketing and one of the sharpest people I know, pulled me aside after a particularly disastrous meeting and said, "Logan, he has no idea what he's doing. He's going to destroy everything you've built." She wasn't wrong. Mason's charisma and energy weren't cutting it. He kept trying to implement ideas he'd seen on TikTok or read about in random business books without understanding how our company actually worked. At one point, he suggested we spend half our annual budget on a flashy new ad campaign, without consulting the marketing team or even reviewing the data. When I tried to warn him about how risky it was, he laughed and said, "Logan, this is why you're stuck in a box. You're too afraid to take risks." The campaign bombed. Hard. And guess who got the blame? Me. Mason told the board I hadn't fully supported his vision, which made it difficult for the campaign to succeed. I wanted to scream. Instead, I just clenched my jaw and said, "Understood," because I needed to stay calm if I was going to figure out how to handle this. Around this time, I started noticing something strange. Mason seemed almost deliberate in his incompetence. It wasn't just that he was bad at his job. It was like he was actively trying to make me look bad. He'd accidentally forget to invite me to key meetings, then act surprised when I didn't show up. He'd promise clients things we couldn't deliver, then blame me when we couldn't follow through. And every time I tried to push back or present a solution, he'd brush me off with some condescending comment like, "Logan, you're too emotional. This is why you're not CO." Too emotional? Mason once threw a fit because the office coffee machine was out of oat milk. Meanwhile, my parents were no help at all. Catherine kept insisting that Mason was learning and that I needed to give him time. Richard stayed quiet most of the time, but I could tell he wasn't thrilled with how things were going either. Still, he wasn't about to stand up to Catherine or Mason. At this point, I was running on pure frustration. I couldn't figure out why my parents were so hell-bent on making Mason the face of the company. Sure, he was their favorite, but this went beyond favoritism. It felt like there was some bigger plan I wasn't privy to. That's when I decided to dig a little deeper. I started going through old company files, looking for anything that might explain my parents' sudden obsession with Mason's career. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Just something, anything, that could make sense of this mess. It didn't take long for me to find something suspicious. Buried in a stack of financial reports was a series of unusual transactions from about a year ago. Large sums of money had been funneled into a consulting firm I'd never heard of. The firm's name, Praxis Solutions, sounded generic enough, but when I looked it up, I couldn't find any real information about it. No website, no LinkedIn profiles, nothing. I brought this up to Lucas, my best friend and former college roommate, who happens to be a financial analyst. He agreed to help me dig into it. A few days later, he called me and said, "Logan, I don't think this Praxis Solutions is a real consulting firm. I think it's a shell company." A shell company, as in, a fake business used to hide money or move it around without anyone noticing. But why would my parents be involved with something like that? And what did it have to do with Mason? I didn't have time to dwell on it because Mason was cooking up his next big disaster. He decided to streamline operations by merging two departments, without consulting the department heads or even giving them a heads up. The merger caused total chaos, with employees unsure of their roles and projects falling through the cracks. When I tried to step in and fix the mess, Mason accused me of undermining his authority. It was like every decision he made was designed to create problems, and I was always the one left cleaning up after him. The tipping point came during a quarterly board meeting. Mason was supposed to present the company's performance, but he didn't bother preparing anything. Instead, he rambled on about vision and synergy while completely ignoring the hard numbers. When one of the board members asked about our declining profit margins, Mason froze and said, "Logan can explain that." Excuse me? I hadn't even been included in the prep for this meeting. I didn't have the data in front of me, and Mason knew it. Still, I did my best to answer the board's questions while Mason sat there smirking. After the meeting, he pulled me aside and said, "See, this is why I need you to stay in your lane. I'm the big picture guy. You handle the details." I wanted to punch him in the face. Instead, I just walked away. Because by this point, I'd realized something important. Mason wasn't the real enemy here. My parents were. They were the ones who'd put him in this position, and they were the ones enabling his behavior. If I wanted to fix this, I needed to go after the root of the problem. That night, I sat down with Lucas and Jenna to brainstorm a plan. We went over everything I'd uncovered so far: the shell company, the financial discrepancies, Mason's disastrous decisions, and started piecing together a strategy. If my parents thought they could push me out of the company I'd helped build, they were about to get a rude awakening. This wasn't just about saving my career anymore. It was about saving the company and my sanity. So, after my talk with Lucas and Jenna, I became obsessed with figuring out what my parents were up to. Mason was clearly their puppet, but for what purpose? Why push me aside after everything I'd done for the company? And why were they willing to risk the company's success for someone as wildly unqualified as Mason? Lucas and I kept digging into the shell company, Praxis Solutions, and it paid off. Turns out, Praxis wasn't just moving money around. It was a holding account for a series of real estate investments. That's where things got interesting. Some of the properties linked to Praxis were in my parents' name. Others? Mason's name. And the amounts being shuffled through these accounts were enormous. Far more than the company could afford to lose without serious consequences. I couldn't wrap my head around it at first. Were they embezzling from the company? If so, why? My parents are wealthy. They don't need to steal. And why involve Mason in something so reckless when he's barely capable of managing a grocery list? I decided it was time for some answers. The next weekend, I went to my parents' house for what I pretended was a casual family dinner. Mason wasn't there, which was just as well. I didn't want him running interference. After dinner, when it was just me, Catherine, and Richard sitting around the table, I brought it up. So, I started, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I came across something interesting in the financial reports recently." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what's that?" "Praxis Solutions." I let the name hang in the air for a moment, watching their reactions. Catherine stiffened slightly. Richard's hand froze mid-reach for his glass of wine. "Bingo. I couldn't find much about it online," I continued, "but it looks like the company's been funneling money into some real estate investments. Quite a bit of money, actually. Some of it even seems to be in Mason's name. Care to explain?" There was a long, tense silence. Then Catherine said, "Logan, I don't think you understand the full picture. That's why I'm asking," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the fact that my heart was pounding. Catherine sighed and exchanged a glance with Richard, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Finally," she said, "your father and I have been planning for the future of the company. We've been diversifying our assets, ensuring that we're not reliant on a single income stream. Praxis is part of that strategy, right?" I said, leaning forward. "And how does Mason fit into this grand strategy?" Catherine's face hardened. "Mason is the future of this family, Logan. He has the potential to take the company to new heights. But he needs guidance and support, and that's what we're giving him." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're risking the entire company on someone who doesn't even know how to do basic accounting. Mason doesn't care about the business. He's using it as his personal playground." "That's not true," Catherine snapped. "Mason is learning. He just needs time. Time. That's all they ever said. Mason needs time. Mason needs support." I'd been running this company for years, but apparently, I didn't deserve any of that. I turned to my dad. "And you're okay with this? Letting her run the company into the ground just to coddle Mason?" Richard flinched but didn't answer. Catherine answered for him. "We're protecting our family legacy, Logan. Something you clearly don't understand." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about Mason. This was about control. Catherine wasn't just protecting Mason. She was protecting herself. Praxis Solutions wasn't a legitimate business strategy. It was a way to consolidate power and make sure I couldn't challenge her authority. Mason was a pawn in her game, and I was the threat she needed to neutralize. You're not protecting the legacy, I said slowly. You're protecting your legacy. You're afraid I'll take over and make changes you don't agree with. Watch your tone, Catherine said sharply. You have no idea what you're talking about, don't I? I shot back. I've been running the day-to-day operations for years. The company's been thriving because of me, not Mason. And now you're undermining everything I've built to keep me out of the picture. Admit it. Catherine didn't say anything, but the look on her face told me I'd hit a nerve. Richard, to his credit, finally spoke up. Logan, it's not what you think. We're trying to secure a future for all of you. Don't, I interrupted. Don't insult me by pretending this is for my benefit. I stood up, my hands shaking. If you think I'm going to stand by while you and Mason destroy everything I've worked for, you're dead wrong. I'm not some kid you can manipulate. This ends now. Catherine's face went pale, but she didn't stop me as I walked out of the house. I didn't know exactly what my next move would be, but I knew one thing. I couldn't let them keep control of the company. Not if I wanted to save it. After that conversation, I went into overdrive. I started gathering evidence, financial records, emails, anything that could prove what was going on. Lucas and Jenna were instrumental in helping me put together a plan. We decided that the best way to take back control was to expose Mason's incompetence and my parents' shady dealings to the board. But before we could make our move, Mason did something that pushed everything into overdrive. He approved a deal with a sketchy supplier that violated multiple regulations. Not only did it put the company at risk of legal trouble, but it also jeopardized our reputation with long-standing clients. When I found out, I realized I couldn't wait any longer. It was time to fight back. After Mason approved that reckless supplier deal, I knew I had to act immediately. The deal wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. The supplier had a history of cutting corners, and partnering with them violated several industry regulations. If the deal went through, the company could face massive fines, lawsuits, and permanent damage to our reputation. I tried to stop it before it was finalized, but Mason wouldn't listen. When I confronted him about it, he smirked and said, "Relax, Logan. You're just overthinking again. This is the kind of bold move that'll put us on the map." I wanted to scream. Bold? It was suicide. But Mason wouldn't back down, and my parents were still standing by him. Catherine brushed off my concerns with her usual patronizing tone. "Logan, you're so risk-averse. That's why you'll never be a visionary like Mason." That was it. I'd had enough. If they were going to ignore me, I'd make sure the board couldn't. For weeks, I'd been collecting everything I could. Emails, financial reports, meeting transcripts, anything that would expose what was really going on. Jenna was a huge help here. She'd been quietly documenting all of Mason's missteps, from missed deadlines to inappropriate behavior. Together, we compiled a damning case against him. Lucas, meanwhile, was digging deeper into Praxis Solutions. He found more shady transactions, including payments to consultants who didn't exist and unexplained withdrawals that lined up suspiciously with Mason's lavish spending sprees. It was all starting to come together. Mason wasn't just incompetent, he was benefiting from my parents' scheme in ways that went far beyond favoritism. The final piece of the puzzle came when Lucas discovered that one of the properties Praxis had invested in was a beachfront condo, in Mason's name. My parents were siphoning company funds to bankroll his lifestyle. I called an emergency meeting with the board. I knew I'd have one shot to convince them, and I needed to come prepared. Jenna and Lucas helped me put together a presentation that laid out everything. The financial discrepancies, the supplier deal, Mason's incompetence, and my parents' role in enabling all of it. The day of the meeting, I walked into the boardroom feeling like I was about to go to war. Mason was already there, lounging in his chair like he didn't have a care in the world. Catherine and Richard sat beside him, looking confident as ever. They clearly thought this was going to be another one of their family discussions where they could brush off my concerns. But this wasn't a family discussion. This was business. I started by outlining the supplier deal and explaining why it was a disaster waiting to happen. Then I moved on to Mason's track record, listing every poor decision he'd made since becoming CEO. As I spoke, I could see the board members exchanging uneasy glances. They'd been skeptical of Mason from the start, but now they were starting to realize just how bad things really were. Then I dropped the bombshell, the Praxis scheme. I showed them the financial records, the shell company details, and the property in Mason's name. By the time I was done, the room was dead silent. Mason was the first to speak. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice shaking. "Logan's just bitter because he's not in charge anymore." "Bitter?" I shot back. "Bitter doesn't even begin to cover it. I've spent years building this company, only for you to waltz in and treat it like your personal playground. This isn't about me being bitter. It's about you being unfit to lead." Catherine jumped in, her voice cold. "Logan, you're overstepping. This is a family business. We make decisions as a family." I turned to the board. "Does this look like a family business to you?" Because to me, it looks like a slush fund for Mason's lifestyle. "If you want this company to survive, you need to take action now." The room erupted into chaos. Mason tried to defend himself. Catherine kept insisting that I was blowing things out of proportion, and Richard just sat there looking like he wanted to disappear. But the board wasn't buying it. By the end of the meeting, they'd voted unanimously to suspend Mason as CEO pending further investigation. With Mason out of the picture, I was reinstated as COO and given temporary authority to manage the company while the board sorted everything out. My first priority was undoing the damage Mason had done. I canceled the supplier deal, restructured the departments he'd merged, and worked overtime to reassure clients and employees that we were back on track. It wasn't easy. The company's reputation had taken a hit, and morale was at an all-time low. But with Jenna's help, I managed to stabilize things. Slowly but surely, we started to recover. Meanwhile, my parents were furious. Catherine called me almost daily, demanding to know why I was turning on my own family. Richard sent a few half-hearted messages asking me to reconsider. Mason, of course, was nowhere to be found, probably sulking in his beachfront condo. I didn't care. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Just when I thought things were settling down, Lucas came to me with one final revelation. While digging through Praxis's financial records, he'd found evidence that the shell company wasn't just funding Mason's lifestyle, it was also being used to cover up losses from a failed investment my parents had made years ago. They'd been quietly bleeding the company dry to pay off their debts, and Mason's appointment as CEO was their way of keeping me from finding out. I felt sick. My own parents had been using the company I'd worked so hard to build as their personal piggy bank, and they'd thrown me under the bus to protect their secret. That was the moment I realized I couldn't trust them anymore. Not with the company. Not with anything. At the next board meeting, I presented Lucas's findings and made my case for permanently removing Mason and my parents from any decision-making roles in the company. It wasn't easy. Catherine fought tooth and nail to keep her influence, but in the end, the board sided with me. Mason's role was officially terminated, and my parents' voting power on the board was significantly reduced. I was appointed interim CEO, with the understanding that I'd need to prove myself over the next year. Fine by me. I wasn't interested in power plays. I just wanted to fix the mess they'd made. Since then, I've been working non-stop to rebuild the company. It hasn't been easy, but we're finally starting to see real progress. As for my family, well, things are tense, to say the least. Catherine and Richard still think I betrayed them, and Mason refuses to speak to me. Haley's been supportive, but even she's wary of taking sides. Honestly, I'm okay with that. I've learned the hard way that family and business don't always mix. For now, I'm focused on doing what's best for the company and for myself. After I was officially named interim CEO, the work of rebuilding the company began in earnest. Mason's time as CEO had left us with more problems than I initially realized. Client relationships had been damaged, employee morale was at an all-time low, and the financial mess my parents had created was worse than I'd anticipated. It felt like I was trying to put out a dozen fires at once. Jenna was a lifesaver during this time. She stepped up in a big way, taking on more responsibility and helping me rebuild trust with the team. Together, we started addressing the most immediate issues: stabilizing operations, renegotiating contracts with frustrated clients, and reassuring employees that we were moving in the right direction. One of the toughest parts was dealing with the fallout from the Praxis Solutions scandal. While the board had agreed to keep the details private to avoid a public scandal, the internal investigation had made it clear just how deep the problems ran. My parents had been siphoning money from the company for years, using it to cover their bad investments and fund Mason's lifestyle. It was infuriating to realize how much damage they'd done, but at least now I had the authority to stop it. Speaking of my parents, things between us are complicated. Catherine is still furious with me. She's convinced that I betrayed the family by going to the board and taking Mason down. She's tried to reach out a few times, but it's always the same conversation. Her trying to justify her actions and me refusing to let her off the hook. I don't know if we'll ever fully reconcile, and honestly, I'm okay with that. I can't keep letting her manipulate me. Richard, on the other hand, has been quieter. I think he feels guilty, though he hasn't said it outright. He's reached out a few times to check in, but I can't tell he doesn't know how to repair the damage. Part of me wants to forgive him, but another part can't forget how he sat by and let all of this happen. And then there's Mason. I haven't spoken to him since the board voted to remove him. He sent me a single text after the meeting. "You'll regret this." That's it. No apology, no acknowledgement of the chaos he caused, just a threat. I doubt he'll ever take responsibility for his actions, and I've made my peace with the fact that we're probably not going to have a relationship moving forward. It sucks, but I'd rather have distance than more drama. Haley has been a surprising source of support through all of this. She stayed out of the initial conflict, but once everything came to light, she reached out to let me know she had my back. "You did what had to be done," she told me over coffee one morning. "Mason and Mom might never see it, but you saved the company and the family in a way." It meant more than I can say to hear her say that. About 2 months after I was named interim CEO, the board approached me with an offer. They wanted me to take the role permanently. At first, I wasn't sure if I wanted it. After everything that had happened, the idea of tying myself even more deeply to the company, and, by extension, my family, felt overwhelming. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about the company anymore. This was about me. For years, I'd worked in the shadow of my family's expectations, trying to prove myself and gain their approval. But now, for the first time, I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it because I believed in what the company could become, and because I believed in myself. So, I said yes. Since then, things have been surprisingly good. The company is finally back on stable footing, and we've even started to grow again. Jenna officially became my right hand, and Lucas has been consulting for us on some big projects. The team seems more motivated than ever, and I've made it a priority to create a culture where everyone feels valued, something that was sorely lacking under Mason's leadership. As for my personal life, I'm finally learning to set boundaries. For years, I let my parents' opinions dictate my decisions, but not anymore. I still see them occasionally, but I've made it clear that our relationship will never go back to the way it was. If they can't respect me as an equal, then they don't get to be part of my life. Haley and I have grown closer, which has been a silver lining in all of this. She's been a great sounding board, and we've started meeting up regularly to talk about everything from work to life in general. It feels good to have at least one family member I can rely on. And Mason? Last I heard, he was living in that beachfront condo, posting Instagram stories about his hustle and grind. I wish him well, but I'm not holding my breath for an apology. Looking back, I think the hardest part of all of this wasn't losing my job or dealing with Mason's antics. It was realizing just how far my parents were willing to go to protect their own interests, even at my expense. That hurt more than anything Mason did. But in a way, it was also freeing. Once I stopped chasing their approval, I started to see things more clearly. At the end of the day, I'm proud of what I've accomplished, not just professionally, but personally. I stood up for myself, fought for what I believed in, and came out stronger on the other side. The company is thriving, my relationships are healthier, even if they're fewer, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. So, that's my story. If you're going through something similar, whether it's family drama, workplace politics, or just trying to figure out where you fit in the world, my advice is this: trust yourself. People will try to make you doubt your instincts, but deep down, you know what's right. Fight for it. It's worth it.